What happens when kindness sparks a chain reaction? This is the story of an elderly couple who fed a homeless man daily, and the unexpected gift he left them that changed lives forever. Stay tuned. It's a reminder that even the smallest acts can create ripples of hope. Welcome back to Tales with Sekos. Today, I am going to share an exciting story with you, so enjoy it till end for the unique twists and turns, and one more small act of kindness to subscribe this channel to help me reach my first 1,000 subscribers. The morning sun rose slowly over the sleepy town, casting golden light across rooftops and tree-lined streets. It was the kind of quiet, unassuming place where everyone knew each other, at least by sight, and life moved at a pace that felt almost timeless. Walter and Margaret lived in a modest house near the edge of town, their home nestled between rows of maple trees whose leaves turned fiery shades of orange and red during autumn. To anyone passing by, they appeared to be an ordinary elderly couple, living out their twilight years in peace. But there was something extraordinary about them, something that set them apart from most people in ways both subtle and profound. For decades, Walter and Margaret had shared not only a home, but also a deep commitment to kindness. They weren't wealthy, far from it. Living off a modest pension, they understood the value of every penny. Yet what they lacked in material wealth, they made up for in generosity. Every morning, without fail, they prepared 2 meals instead of one for themselves and another for someone who needed it far more than they did. It all began one cold winter morning several years ago, when Margaret noticed a figure huddled beneath a park bench just a few blocks away. She had been out for her usual walk, bundled in a thick coat and scarf, when she saw him, a man wrapped in a threadbare blanket, his breath visible in the frosty air. His face was weathered, his eyes hollow, and his hands trembling as he clutched a cardboard sign that read, "Anything helps." Margaret hesitated for only a moment before turning back toward home. "Walter," she called softly as she stepped inside, "we need to do something." Without question, Walter joined her in the kitchen, where they quickly assembled a warm sandwich and filled a thermos with hot soup. Together, they walked back to the park, their boots crunching against the icy ground. When they approached the man, Margaret knelt beside him, offering the food with a gentle smile. "Here," she said softly, "this is for you." The man looked up, startled at first, then overwhelmed with gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. That simple exchange marked the beginning of a tradition, one that would continue for years to come. Walter and Margaret didn't stop with that single act of kindness. Over time, they began leaving food daily on their porch for whoever might need it. Word spread quietly among those struggling to survive, and soon, a homeless man named Jacob became a regular recipient of their generosity. He was a quiet soul, often seen wandering the streets with a tattered backpack slung over his shoulder. No one knew much about him, where he came from, why he ended up on the streets, or what dreams he still held onto. All they knew was that he carried himself with a dignity that belied his circumstances. Jacob rarely spoke, but his gratitude was evident in the small gestures he offered in return. Sometimes he left a note scrawled on scraps of paper, simple words like, "Thank you," or "God bless you." Other times, he lingered briefly to nod in acknowledgement before disappearing into the shadows. For Walter and Margaret, these fleeting moments were enough. They didn't seek recognition or reward. They simply believed in doing what was right. But here's the thing about acts of kindness. They often go unnoticed by the world, yet they leave an indelible mark on those involved. For Jacob, the meals provided more than sustenance. They were a lifeline, a reminder that even in his darkest moments, he hadn't been forgotten. And for Walter and Margaret, feeding Jacob became a source of purpose, a way to make their twilight years meaningful. To understand the depth of this connection, we must first delve into the lives of Walter and Margaret themselves. Though they appeared content in their later years, their journey had not been without hardship. Walter had worked as a mechanic for nearly 4 decades, his hands calloused from years of labor. Margaret, meanwhile, had spent much of her life caring for others, first as a nurse, then as a devoted mother to their 2 children. Together, they had weathered storms both literal and metaphorical, financial struggles, health scares, and the bittersweet passage of time as their children grew up and moved away. Yet through it all, they clung to one guiding principle: kindness costs nothing but means everything. It was a lesson passed down from their parents, who had raised them during the Great Depression, a time when communities relied on each other to survive. Walter often recalled stories of neighbors sharing meager rations or pooling resources to help those in need. Margaret remembered her mother's insistence on inviting strangers to dinner whenever there was extra food. "There's always room for one more," she would say, setting an extra plate at the table. These memories shaped Walter and Margaret's worldview, instilling in them a belief that compassion could bridge even the widest divides. So when they encountered Jacob, it wasn't just charity, it was an extension of who they were. Jacob, too, carried scars that ran deeper than his worn appearance suggested. Born into poverty, he had grown up in a series of foster homes, bouncing from one temporary family to the next. As a teenager, he dropped out of school to work odd jobs, hoping to save enough money to escape his circumstances. But life had other plans. A string of bad luck, a car accident that left him unable to work, mounting medical bills, and eventually the loss of his apartment pushed him onto the streets. By the time he met Walter and Margaret, he had resigned himself to invisibility, believing that no one cared about people like him anymore. But Walter and Margaret proved him wrong. Day after day, week after week, they showed up, not with fanfare or judgment, but with quiet consistency. Slowly, imperceptibly, Jacob began to change. The weight of despair lifted ever so slightly, replaced by a flicker of hope. He started taking better care of himself, washing his clothes at the local laundromat and shaving regularly. He even ventured into town occasionally, browsing second-hand shops for books to pass the time. Though he never voiced it aloud, he began to dream again. Small, fragile dreams of finding stability, of contributing something meaningful to the world. One crisp autumn morning, something unusual happened. As Walter and Margaret stepped onto their porch to place the day's meal, they noticed a small package wrapped in brown paper sitting beside the door. Curious, Margaret picked it up, turning it over in her hands. There was no note, no indication of who it might be from, just a neatly tied ribbon holding the parcel together. Walter raised an eyebrow. "Do you think it's from Jacob?" he asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Margaret shrugged, unwrapping the package carefully. Inside, she found a weathered leather journal, its cover worn smooth from years of use. Flipping it open, she discovered pages filled with handwritten entries, poems, reflections, and sketches, all penned in Jacob's unmistakable scrawl. On the first page, a short message read, "To Walter and Margaret, thank you for seeing me when others looked away. These are my thoughts, my dreams, my struggles. I hope they remind you that your kindness has changed more than you'll ever know." Margaret's hands trembled as she turned the pages, her eyes scanning the words within. Each entry painted a vivid picture of Jacob's life, the hardships he endured, the fleeting moments of joy, and the deep gratitude he felt for the couple who had shown him compassion. One poem stood out in particular. "Beneath the bridge where shadows fall, I dreamt of light, though none seemed real. But then came two with hearts so tall, who taught me love can heal." Walter placed a comforting hand on Margaret's shoulder as tears streamed down her face. "We had no idea," she whispered, her voice breaking. No idea how much this meant to him. That evening, as they sat together in their living room, Walter and Margaret couldn't stop thinking about the journal. It wasn't just a gift, it was a window into Jacob's soul, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. But it also raised questions. Why now? What had prompted Jacob to leave such a personal keepsake on their porch? And perhaps most importantly, where was he now? The next morning, they decided to visit the bridge where Jacob usually stayed. Armed with fresh food and a sense of urgency, they hoped to find answers, or at the very least, thank him properly. But when they arrived, the spot beneath the bridge was empty. No blankets, no belongings, no sign of Jacob anywhere. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air. Determined not to give up, Walter and Margaret began asking around town. They spoke to shopkeepers, neighbors, and even other members of the community who frequented the area. Slowly, pieces of the puzzle began to emerge. Jacob hadn't simply disappeared. He'd moved on. Inspired by the couple's kindness, he'd taken steps to rebuild his life, finding temporary work and shelter through a local outreach program. But his journey didn't end there. In fact, what he did next would touch the lives of countless others, including Walter and Margaret, in ways they never imagined. Walter and Margaret's search for Jacob led them to a small community center tucked away in a quiet corner of town. It was a place they'd driven past countless times, but never paid much attention to until now. Inside, volunteers bustled about, organizing clothing drives, serving meals and offering support to those in need. The air buzzed with energy, a stark contrast to the emptiness they'd felt beneath the bridge. They approached the front desk, where a young woman named Lisa greeted them warmly. "Can I help you?" she asked, her smile inviting yet curious. Margaret hesitated for a moment before responding. "We're looking for someone, a man named Jacob. We've been leaving food for him on our porch for years, but recently, well, he left us something. A journal." She held up the worn leather book as if it were evidence of their connection. Lisa's eyes widened in recognition. "Oh, Jacob. Yes, I know him. He's been coming here for a while now. Actually, he's one of our success stories." Success stories? Walter and Margaret exchanged glances, surprised by the term. To them, Jacob had always been a quiet figure on the fringes of society, someone struggling to survive, not thriving. Yet Lisa's words painted a different picture. When Jacob first arrived, Lisa explained, he was hesitant to accept help. But over time, he opened up. He started volunteering here, assisting with meal prep and cleanup. Eventually, we helped him secure temporary housing and part-time work at a local warehouse. He's still working on rebuilding his life, but he's come so far. Margaret clutched the journal tightly, her heart swelling with pride. "Do you know where we can find him?" she asked softly. Lisa nodded. "He usually stops by around noon to lend a hand. If you wait a little while, I'm sure he'll be here." While they waited, Walter and Margaret wandered through the bustling space, taking in the sights and sounds of the community center. They observed the interactions between volunteers and visitors, struck by the sense of camaraderie and mutual respect. For the first time, they truly understood the scope of the challenges faced by people like Jacob and the transformative power of compassion. One corner of the room caught Margaret's eye, a bulletin board covered in photographs and notes. Each image told a story: a family reunited after months apart, a teenager graduating from a job training program, a senior citizen teaching art classes to children. Benevolence wasn't just an idea here. It was a living, breathing force that connected everyone under one roof. As they explored further, Lisa joined them, eager to share more about the center's mission. "We don't just provide food or shelter," she explained. "We focus on empowerment. Whether it's helping someone find employment, offering counseling services, or simply giving them a safe space to exist, our goal is to restore dignity and hope." Walter nodded thoughtfully. "That's exactly what Jacob did for us," he said quietly. "He reminded us that kindness isn't just about giving, it's about seeing someone for who they truly are." Moments later, Jacob appeared, pushing a cart filled with donated goods. At first, he didn't notice Walter and Margaret standing near the entrance. His focus was entirely on the task at hand, his movements deliberate and purposeful. But when he turned and saw them, his expression shifted from surprise to joy. "Walter, Margaret," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "What are you doing here?" Margaret stepped forward, holding out the journal. "We found this on our porch," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Why didn't you tell us you were moving on?" Jacob smiled sheepishly, rubbing the back of his neck. "I wanted to leave something behind, to say thank you. Words never seemed enough, so I thought, maybe this would explain how much your kindness meant to me." Walter shook his head, tears glistening in his eyes. "You didn't owe us anything, Jacob. Helping you was its own reward." Jacob's gaze dropped momentarily, but when he looked up again, there was a newfound determination in his eyes. "That's just it," he said earnestly. "Your help wasn't just for me. It gave me the strength to start helping others, and now I want to pay it forward." Over the next hour, Jacob shared his journey with Walter and Margaret, the struggles he'd faced, the lessons he'd learned, and the dreams he was beginning to chase. He spoke of late nights spent writing in the journal, pouring his thoughts onto paper as a way to process his emotions. He described the moment he realized he could use his experiences to inspire others, becoming a beacon of hope for those still trapped in cycles of hardship. "This place saved me," Jacob admitted, gesturing to the bustling community center. "But it was your kindness that showed me I mattered, that I could matter again. Now, I'm trying to do the same for others, to remind them that they're not alone." As he spoke, Walter and Margaret felt a profound sense of fulfillment. Their simple act of feeding Jacob hadn't just changed his life, it had sparked a chain reaction of generosity and resilience. And yet, Jacob wasn't finished surprising them. Before they left, Jacob handed them an envelope. "There's one more thing," he said, with a shy smile. "Open it when you get home." Curious but trusting, Walter and Margaret accepted the envelope and bid Jacob farewell. As they walked back to their car, the weight of the day's discoveries settled over them. They had set out searching for answers, only to find inspiration instead. When they returned home, they sat together at the kitchen table, the envelope resting between them. With trembling hands, Margaret opened it and pulled out a single sheet of paper. On it, Jacob had written a heartfelt letter. Dear Walter and Margaret, thank you for teaching me that even in my darkest moments, there is light. Because of you, I've learned to see the world differently, not as a place of scarcity, but of abundance. Your kindness has inspired me to create something lasting, a fund to support others like me, helping them take their first steps toward a better future. Please consider this letter an invitation to join me in making a difference. Together, we can ensure no one feels invisible again. With gratitude, Jacob. Walter and Margaret stared at the letter, overwhelmed by its significance. This wasn't just a gesture of thanks, it was a call to action. Jacob had taken their small act of kindness and transformed it into something monumental, proving that compassion is contagious. Inspired by his vision, they decided to contribute to the fund, using their savings to amplify its reach. Word of the initiative spread quickly, drawing support from neighbors, friends, and even strangers touched by Jacob's story. What began as a humble effort to feed one person had blossomed into a movement, a testament to the ripple effects of even the smallest acts of kindness. But Jacob's story didn't end there. In fact, it was only the beginning. Over the following months, Walter and Margaret watched as the fund grew, providing resources and opportunities for dozens of individuals striving to rebuild their lives. They attended events hosted by the community center, meeting others whose journeys mirrored Jacob's. Each story reinforced the same truth. Kindness isn't just an act, it's a catalyst for change. As winter approached, bringing colder days and longer nights, Walter and Margaret reflected on how far they'd come since that first morning they met Jacob. Their lives had been enriched in ways they never anticipated, reminding them that giving and receiving are two sides of the same coin. One evening, as snow began to fall outside their window, Margaret turned to Walter with a thoughtful expression. Do you think Jacob knows how much he's changed us too? She asked quietly. Walter smiled, placing a reassuring hand over hers. I think he does, he replied. And I think that's the beauty of it. Kindness doesn't just flow in one direction, it connects us all. Meanwhile, Jacob continued to pour his energy into the community center, mentoring newcomers and sharing his story whenever possible. One such newcomer was Maria, a single mother who had been living out of her car with her two young children. Through the fund, she secured affordable housing and enrolled in a vocational training program. Within months, she landed a stable job and began volunteering at the center herself. When Walter and Margaret met her during a holiday gathering, they were struck by her resilience and her gratitude. If it weren't for this place, Maria told them, tears glistening in her eyes, I don't know where we'd be right now. This isn't just a charity, it's a family. Another story belonged to James, a veteran struggling with PTSD after years of service. Isolated and overwhelmed, he had turned to alcohol to numb the pain. But when he stumbled upon the community center one freezing night, everything changed. With counseling services funded by Jacob's initiative, James began his journey toward healing. By spring, he was leading workshops on mental health awareness, sharing his experiences to help others facing similar battles. You saved me, James said to Walter and Margaret during a quiet moment after one of his sessions. Not directly, maybe, but your kindness gave Jacob the strength to keep going, and because of him, I found mine. These stories weren't isolated incidents. They were threads woven into the fabric of a larger tapestry, a tapestry created by countless acts of compassion, large and small. Walter and Margaret marveled at how far their simple gesture had traveled. What began as a sandwich left on their porch had become a lifeline for dozens, then hundreds of individuals. And yet, even as they celebrated these victories, they couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to come. That realization came one crisp morning in early spring when Jacob appeared unexpectedly on their doorstep. Gone was the weary man they'd once known. In his place stood someone transformed, confident, purposeful, and brimming with energy. Beside him stood Lisa, the volunteer coordinator from the community center, holding a stack of papers and wearing an expression of barely contained excitement. We need to show you something, Jacob said. ushering them inside. Once seated in their cozy living room, Lisa spread the papers across the coffee table. They were plans for a new building, a permanent home for the community center, designed to expand its reach and deepen its impact. "This is incredible," Margaret breathed, tracing the blueprint with trembling fingers. "But how?" Jacob grinned, his eyes shining with pride. "Thanks to the fund and the generosity of so many people, we've raised enough to break ground. But we wanted to name it after you two, the Walter and Margaret Center for Hope and Renewal." Walter shook his head, visibly moved. No, this isn't about us. It's about everyone who's worked together to make this happen." Lisa leaned forward, her voice firm but kind. "That's exactly why it should bear your names. You lit the spark that started all of this. Without you, none of us would be here today." Margaret wiped away tears, unable to argue further. She glanced at Walter, who nodded silently, overcome with emotion. In that moment, they understood something profound. Legacy isn't built on grand gestures or singular achievements. It's shaped by the cumulative effect of countless small actions, the ripples we create when we choose to care. The groundbreaking ceremony for the Walter and Margaret Center for Hope and Renewal took place on a crisp spring morning, with the sun casting golden light over the gathered crowd. It was a day filled with laughter, tears, and stories of transformation, a celebration not just of a building, but of the lives it would touch. Walter and Margaret stood side by side, their hands clasped tightly as they watched the community come together in ways they had never imagined. Jacob opened the ceremony with a speech that brought the audience to its feet. His voice trembled at first, but as he spoke, it grew stronger, filled with conviction and gratitude. "When I first met Walter and Margaret," he began, "I didn't think anyone cared about people like me. But they showed me that kindness isn't just an act, it's a lifeline. They gave me hope when I needed it most, and because of them, I found the strength to give back. This center isn't just bricks and mortar, it's proof that compassion can change the world." As Jacob stepped down from the podium, Lisa took his place, her eyes shining with pride. She recounted the countless stories of individuals whose lives had been transformed by the center. From Maria, the single mother who now led parenting workshops, to James, the veteran who inspired others to seek help for PTSD. Each story reinforced the same truth. Kindness creates ripples, and those ripples grow into waves of change. Walter and Margaret listened intently, their hearts swelling with emotion. They had always believed in the power of small acts, but seeing the tangible results, the faces of those whose lives had been touched, was overwhelming. Margaret leaned closer to Walter, whispering softly, "Do you remember that first morning, when we left that sandwich on the porch?" Walter smiled, his eyes glistening. "How could I forget? We had no idea it would lead to this." After the speeches, attendees were invited to tour the construction site, where volunteers were already hard at work, laying the foundation. Children ran through the area, laughing and playing, while adults marveled at the blueprints displayed on easels. The design was thoughtful and inclusive, featuring spaces for job training, counseling, art therapy, and even a small garden where residents could grow their own vegetables. Every detail reflected the values of hope, renewal, and community that Walter and Margaret had embodied through their kindness. One corner of the site caught Margaret's eye, a mural painted by local artists. It depicted a tree with sprawling branches, each leaf bearing the name of someone who had contributed to the project. At the base of the tree, two names stood out, Walter and Margaret. Beneath them, a simple inscription read, "Kindness plants seeds of hope." Tears streamed down Margaret's face as she traced the words with her fingers. "We didn't do anything special," she murmured. "Just what anyone should have done." A young girl standing nearby overheard her and tugged gently on her sleeve. "You did something amazing," she said earnestly. "My mom says if it weren't for you, we wouldn't be here today." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the construction site, Walter and Margaret lingered behind, reluctant to leave. Jacob joined them, his expression thoughtful. "There's one more thing," he said, pulling a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "I wrote this for you both, to remind you why none of this would have been possible without you." Curious, Margaret unfolded the paper and read aloud, "Kindness is a seed. Plant it wisely, nurture it patiently, and watch it grow beyond what you can imagine." Walter and Margaret looked around at the vibrant community surrounding them, a testament to the power of planting seeds of kindness. From feeding a homeless man beneath a bridge to building a center that inspired hope and renewal, their journey proved that no act of compassion is ever wasted. But the story doesn't end here. In fact, it continues to unfold every day, in ways large and small. The center became a beacon of hope, not just for their town, but for neighboring communities as well. People traveled from miles away to volunteer, donate, or simply witness the magic of what Walter, Margaret, and Jacob had created together. And within its walls, new stories emerged. Stories of resilience, redemption, and renewal. One such story belonged to Emma, a teenage runaway who found refuge at the center after months of living on the streets. Through counseling and mentorship programs, she rediscovered her passion for writing and eventually published a collection of poems inspired by her experiences. Another story came from Mr. Thompson, a retired teacher who volunteered to tutor children in math and science, reigniting his love for education in the process. Even Lisa, the coordinator, found personal fulfillment in leading the initiative, crediting Walter and Margaret for inspiring her to pursue her dream of social work. Each of these stories was a thread in the tapestry of kindness that Walter and Margaret had unknowingly woven, and though they remained humble, insisting they were merely part of something greater, everyone else saw the truth. They were the spark that lit the flame. As the years passed, Walter and Margaret grew older, their steps slower, but their spirits undiminished. They continued to visit the center regularly, sharing meals with newcomers, listening to their stories, and reminding them that they mattered. Jacob, too, remained a constant presence, mentoring others and ensuring the legacy of kindness endured. On the 10th anniversary of the center's opening, a plaque was unveiled in the main hall. It bore the image of a tree, its branches stretching toward the sky, and an inscription that read, "To Walter and Margaret, whose kindness planted the seeds of hope. May this center continue to nurture the human spirit for generations to come." As Walter and Margaret stood before the plaque, surrounded by friends, family, and strangers turned family, they exchanged a glance that said more than words ever could. They had started with a single act of kindness, a sandwich left on a porch, and ended with a movement that changed lives forever. So, the next time you're faced with an opportunity to help someone in need, remember this story. Remember Walter and Margaret. Remember Jacob. Because in the end, it's not about changing the world. It's about touching one life at a time. And sometimes that's enough to change everything.